John Gillespie is my name, and I am a writer and a consultant who does trans-Pacific work, mainly with businesses. Grew up in Japan. I went there first when I was 2 years old, and altogether I've lived in Japan about 16 years. We help our clients negotiate or get past the cultural differences that do exist between two cultures. And of course our main area of work is between Japan and the United States. And what we try to help people do is in three areas. One is increase knowledge a little bit. Another is to help them with the attitude toward working with and or understanding the other culture. And the third is to give them some skills to develop and to use to be more effective in working with the other culture. Our focus is on skills more than anything else. And the skills are almost all in the area of communication. How do you communicate with people? People who are working in business, they know what they want to say, but how they say it becomes really critical in whether they're successful or not. In the history of Japanese cinema, there is a period called the golden era of Japanese cinema. It really goes from the 40s on into the early 1960s. And these are maybe it even starts earlier, that in the 1930s, with filmmakers like Mizoguchi, and then Ozu, and Kobayashi, and of course Kurosawa. Filmmakers like that. I think the film industry today in Japan is also very, very good, but that's really the golden age. And if I can make a couple of points about those films very briefly. One is that they really show daily life in Japan. And you want to know how people live? Watch look at Japanese movies, and especially the pre-war and then during the war and after the war. I think you find some of the most realistic films representing a culture that you would find in any country. Acting was so good. Takamine Hideko and Hara Setsuko, and of course actors like Mifune Toshiro, Ryu Chishu. These are great actors. They would be great actors on any planet. And then of course you had those great directors. And then you had great script writers. So you have a formula. I don't want to use the word formula, but you have a set of circumstances here that really came together in that period of about 30-35 years in Japanese cinema, where you have some of the best movies ever made anywhere. The kinds of films that become critically acclaimed today in Japan are almost all more of a kind of slice of life, rather than showing something of more epic proportions or that may be symbolic of all of Japanese society and culture. They're more focused on something more specific. My advice would be to first understand the difference between something that's cross-culture and something that's intercultural. Cross-cultural is simply that there are two cultures involved, and you can learn about them. And if you know something about both, you can be a kind of cross-cultural person. But intercultural has with it the connotation, with the nuance of meaning that you interact with people from another culture effectively, which means something has to change. Because if you interact with people from another culture exactly the same way as you interact with people from your own culture, you will not be very successful. So some kind of behavior modification and the way you communicate needs to happen, and it needs to happen, of course, on both parties. People from two different cultures need to learn to be a little bit different in order to be more effective with somebody from another culture. In many universities, you can study intercultural communication as a major. Many businesses have begun to realize the importance of training people to work more effectively with people from other cultures. And so not only can you major in intercultural communication, you can actually work in that field after you get your degree. So I think there's a lot of hope for young people who have an interest in this kind of field. I think I would help the Japanese with their PR. I think that Japan does not have a good image in the world outside Japan. And part of the reason for that is the kind of tribal mentality that the Japanese have. They kind of stick together like a clan or a tribe. They stick together a lot. And let me give you one example. I'll just give you one example. In the last couple of years, Toyota had some real problems mechanically with their cars. There were some problems with the brakes, and I think also a problem with the computer mechanism in the car. And there were some problems. It was that Toyota did not respond well to these problems so that the rest of the world would have a good image of Toyota. I think people who own Toyotas are very loyal, and even with all the brake problems that they had, most Toyota owners said, yes, I will buy another Toyota, it's a great car. But in terms of the image that the company has in the world, it's not very good. And an example is when Mr. Toyoda himself, Toyoda Akio, came to the United States in March of 2010, and there were some hearings in Congress, and he gave a very poor presence. He read his statement, which is okay, but his English, despite the fact that he lived in the U.S. for 6 years, was not very good, and he was not very articulate. And I think by the end of the day, when he was being questioned by the American Congress, the result was not so good. It was almost as if he was trying to hide something or maybe not be completely honest. But I think most people who know him know he is a very honest guy, and he was trying his best. But that very night, he was still in the United States. There was a meeting of the North American, so the United States and Canada, I'm not sure if Mexico was involved in it, but the dealers of Toyota automobiles and trucks. And in that meeting, Mr. Toyota spoke in English, and he apologized profusely for the problems that Toyota had. He even shed tears. And I wondered, after I saw that, why didn't he do that in front of Congress? It's just one example of many where the Japanese presence overseas sometimes does not translate to a good image of the Japanese that is left in the minds of other people. That's something I would like to improve. When I ask them what's like strange or odd or frustrating about Americans, three things almost always come out. One is that they wonder, why don't Americans meet deadlines? So the Japanese have an image that Americans don't meet deadlines. And now I'm not saying these are true or false. That's not the point here. The point is this is a perception that the Japanese have. Another one is they feel Americans in terms of quality in manufacturing are sloppy, and that we don't take care of details, and that as a result the quality of the things we make is much lower than the quality of things that are made in Japan. And the third thing is they wonder why Americans go home early from work. Well, the Japanese say early, but if work hours are until 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock, the Americans tend to work till 5 and go home, or until 6 and then they go home. Now, all Americans don't do that. Some Americans will stay in the office late at night. But generally, in Japanese companies in the United States, when you look around the office at 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock at night, the only people still there are Japanese. So the Japanese, they wonder about that. One is, how do you get an agreement with the Japanese? Many Americans can't understand, when do we have an agreement? How do we know we're on the same page? They're not sure about that. Another one is, they say, what are the Japanese thinking? I don't know what the Japanese think. And they're probably right about that perception, because most Japanese don't say what they think. And the reason, of course, is that an individual opinion in Japan, in a Japanese business, is not important. What's important is consensus. Another one is, why does it take the Japanese so long to make decisions? This is something virtually every American and European wonders about the Japanese. And then going along with the Japanese perception of the Americans leaving early from the office, 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock, Americans wonder, don't Japanese have a private life? Don't they care about their family? Don't they want to spend time with their family? They don't need to be correct, and they don't need to be incorrect. The point is, people have these perceptions. Trust, and you need to have trust to work well with somebody else. Trust is based on behavior. So trust is not based on what you say so much. It's not based on what you feel deep in your heart in terms of your values. Trust is based on what other people see you do, and also, to a lesser extent, hear you say. And by hear you say, I'm not just talking about words, I'm talking about the manner in which you speak. And I'll add to that a couple of other points. One is this: common sense and assumptions are not universal. Everybody doesn't have the same common sense. Everybody doesn't have the same assumptions. So common sense and assumptions are unique to the culture where they are produced. And so the assumptions that we may have about how we interact with people in one culture may not work in another one. But the problem with assumptions and common sense is that we tend not to think about those things because we assume that everybody else has the same common sense and same assumptions. But that's definitely not true, and there's a lot of research that supports this point. And what I really appreciate about the Japanese is a deep sense of things that are beautiful. In other words, the Japanese aesthetics I find extremely appealing. And what happens when one can get inside Japanese aesthetics is that a world that we may not have been aware of opens up, and you learn a whole new world from that.